Diretamente dos Estados Unidos, recebemos agora Shuba Gopal, principal na Glean Signals LLC e uma das maiores referências em People Analytics do mundo. Que vantagens têm os People Analytics para o sucesso das empresas? Qual o impacto da medição da gestão de pessoas nos People Analytics? Saiba tudo agora nas mãos de Shuba Gopal. Bem-vinda!
Hello, everyone. I wish I could give this talk in Portuguese. I don't know enough to really do it. But as the intro video just said, we're going to be talking about measuring impact of HR through people analytics. I'll be honest, what I really wanted to talk about today was the Eurovision contest from last week, where I thought Mimi Cat did an amazing job and should have gotten way more votes than she did. But let's talk about measuring impact of HR. So there are three questions I want to use today to keep us focused on what we're trying to answer. And the first is we have to decide, what do we mean by impact? And then when can we measure the impact? Because it's not always possible, and I'll show you a quick example of when it's not possible. And if we can answer those first questions, then we can get to how do we demonstrate the impact. So let's dive in. The first thing to say, of course, is that impact really amounts to business outcomes that matter for the business. So HR needs to deliver on those key outcomes, and that's what impact means typically. So how does HR do that? There's essentially three ways. The first is you hire great people, you enable them to do amazing work while they're at your company, and then you keep them, you retain great people. So at a high level, this makes perfect sense. The problem is always in the details. How do you do all this? So let's start with the first one. You have to hire great people. Your CEO, your C-suite, they're telling you all the time, we want the best people and we want them right now. And how do you do that? Well, it's easy to hire people, but then you need to say these are the great people, which means you essentially have to measure the quality of a hire. But there's no metric that directly measures great people. So what can you do instead? Well, you can measure time to fill. You can look at first-year turnover. You can look at first-year performance. But the reality is for each of those metrics, someone can argue that isn't a measure of great people. So, as I said, we have these three questions, and we can answer the first two. What do we mean by impact? We're essentially talking about hire, enable, and retain great people. And when can we measure impact? We have to have at least one well-defined metric available to address that impact. And in the case of hire great people, it's too vague. There isn't a good metric. And so in fact, I would argue it is impossible to measure the impact of your hiring if your goal, if your outcome is hire great people. You have to have a more specific outcome. Let's turn to one where we do have a more specific impact and an outcome that we can measure clearly to demonstrate the impact. Retention, retaining your great people, is a key business outcome. And the case for why you should retain your current talent is pretty easy to make. Replacing people is expensive. Depending on the level of the individual who's leaving, the cost to replace them could be anywhere from 40 to 400% of their salary. So it's cost in terms of money. There's also the cost in terms of productivity. There's going to be time and effort lost while that position is filled, and the new person hired ramps up the role of the previous hire. And then there's the risk of what is sometimes called contagion effect, which is that when someone leaves, the people who are closely with them are now also inclined to leave. And so you could very rapidly deplete the resources of a team or a department, a function, because you were unable to retain your top talent. Okay, so we know that retention is an important business outcome. How are we going to measure it? Well, measuring turnover, which is the opposite of retention, the people who are leaving, that is straightforward. You can focus on voluntary turnover. You can look at the average tenure of your employees. You can even sort of put the tenure by different slices. Is it by, do you see higher tenure by more senior people? Do you see it by managers versus individual contributors? Are there higher or lower turnover by department? You see patterns by gender or age. But then the question is, our outcome is actually not turnover, our outcome is retention. So we have to answer the question, what keeps people at the company? And I want to just be clear, your exit survey has some information, but the answer for why people stay is not in your exit survey. Almost always in the exit survey, the top reason given is compensation. I'm going to get paid more at my next job than you were willing to pay me at this job. But the fact of the matter is, you could put more and more compensation on your top talent, you will not retain. The other reason that is often provided in exit surveys is something to do with manager quality. There's that famous saying, people leave managers, not jobs. It is true, but it's only true for most extreme cases. If you have a manager who's completely horrible, of course people will leave. And if you have an amazing manager, of course people will stay. But those are the extremes. And otherwise, people who are okay managers, it's hard to figure out what they need to be better managers, and it's hard to help them become better. So again, in terms of retention, the answer for what keeps people at a company, it's not in the exit survey. Here's where we can turn to some external research and use people analytics to identify the key factors. So in 2022, McKinsey released a white paper looking at people who had left their jobs without another job in hand. In essence, they had resigned without having a next job lined up. And among the top 3 reasons why people chose to do this was the lack of career development and advancement potential at their former employer. In other words, one of the big factors that keeps people at an organization is career progression. And in fact, when you look in the data, and this is example data, it's not based on any real company, but it's similar to that seen in companies that have employees across Europe and the UK. What you see is that the average tenure of an employee, without any change, any kind of change to their job that they were hired to do, they stay about 2.3 years. If there's a role change, even just one change or more than one change, then they stay much longer, almost double, 4.5 years. And you can argue that it makes sense because a role change is career progression. Something has changed about the work you're doing compared with what you did when you were first hired. But I want to be clear that role change is not just a promotion. It can be any change in the type of work, a new project, or an opportunity to learn a new skill. So what you're seeing in this example data is based not just on promotions, but also on lateral moves internally, even shadowing assignments or gig assignments within the company. Anything that allows people to feel like they're learning something new works as a role change and doubles the tenure. Here's the other piece of becomes very obvious when you dig into that. If you look at development offerings, people who enroll in those offerings stay about 2.5 years longer than those who do not. And we're talking about offerings such as leadership development courses, project management training, career coaching, or related courses about career development, because learning a new skill is also a form of career progression. And when you analyze the data for companies where enrollment by employees tracked, what you see is that career development courses increase the likelihood someone will stay. In fact, they increase it almost by 1/5, 21%, more likely to stay if they've taken one of these career development type courses. All right, the next factor, which is sometimes underutilized, I think, in companies, is recognition. People want to be valued for their contributions, and if you can recognize their good work, they're likely to stay longer. And in fact, in a couple companies, and again, this is example data, but in companies where they track who receives recognition, what you see is that individuals who receive recognition are 5 times more likely to stay than those who do not. And often this is more of an effect than the role change. So in fact, you don't need to give them necessarily a promotion, an internal move, a career development course. You just need to recognize them for the good work they're doing to get all of the effect of staying longer. And when we look in companies where they do track this information, typically receiving recognition increases the average tenure by about 1.5 years. And the third point that I want to make is that people stay at a company because they receive these things, such as role changes or recognition, at the right time. And there's a very interesting pattern that has shown up pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. So prior to 2020, in a typical company, and this is based on example data drawn from multiple companies across the US, EU, and the typical employee stayed about 4 to 5 years. And therefore, you had time in which to intervene. They could spend the first couple of years doing it, the role they were hired for, and then you could change the role by giving them a promotion, enrolling them in leadership development, giving them some recognition. You had time to implement all of this. That's actually not the case anymore. Since 2021, the average employee now stays at a company less than 2 years. And so the time to intervene has become much shorter. Within a year of hiring someone, you have to be doing things to show career progression. You have to be offering the role change. You have to be doing the recognition. It is a much shorter window in which HR has an opportunity to intervene and make an impact. All right, so what I'm proposing is essentially that we focus on the right factors at the right time to yield the impact, and that people analytics allows us to identify those right factors in the right time. So specifically, people are twice as likely to stay if they have a role change. They're 21% more likely to stay with professional development courses. And they're 5 times more likely to stay if you just recognize them for their good work. And most importantly, you have to aim to do all this within the first 12 to 18 months of someone's time in the company. So again, just to wrap up, we know that impact are the business outcomes that matter. And what I hope I've shown you very quickly here is that people analytics helps highlight the factors that deliver those desired results. And so I'll just end here by thanking everyone, especially Dr. Martins, for inviting me to present here. Thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn or via my website.